Norm, welcome back. I'm glad to have another opportunity to talk to you about invisible wounds, the emotional journey of a police officer's battle with PTSD. We've had some terrific discussions about your book, and I want to delve a little bit further and talk a little bit more, particularly about something that came up during our last connection. I found it really interesting, very intriguing that you talked about your early interest when you were doing your business degree in human resources, your early interest in human resources, I should say, in HR. And I'm sort of curious, you spoke about HR from a different perspective than what I'm accustomed to. You spoke about how you're able to apply your HR interest and skills in policing, dealing with the public. And I thought, wow, that's really different. I hadn't looked at it from that perspective. Is that a skill you feel that all police officers, first responders should have? An orientation to people, a human resource perspective, and understanding. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I thought that was an interesting observation that you brought up at our last connection.
I don't know if I can say that it is a necessity to for trainees, let's say for example, or new recruits to have a type of course like this. But I do believe, however, what I took from that HR or management degree
Mhm.
was that the communication part of it. To me, that really struck a chord to me, and
Okay.
how communication was very important. And if you fail to develop a proper communication, you're losing your employee basically. So yeah, in a nutshell, I guess that communication part was what I really enjoyed, and I got to use that in policing, not only in policing but in everyday life. So yes, I do believe that, and I think a lot of the police agencies, their training academies, they do teach that some
Okay.
in some sort of way, like de-escalation, the communication part. But maybe could be looked upon by training academies to see if it's enough. Because I found that for me, communicating with violent offenders, especially when they were sober, and I
Mhm.
got to meet them if they were walking on the road and they're not wanted or anything like that, and just stopping there and just asking them how they're doing, just a 1 or 2 minute conversation worked wonders down the line if I had to deal with that same subject when they were high on drugs or alcohol or
Mhm.
both. And then they all of a sudden they knew me a little bit. I wasn't just a police officer uh, that wore a uniform.
Mhm. So when you talk about the communication side, I guess I'm assuming you're talking about your relating style, the way you communicate, your skills at communicating and listening and getting a point across. Am I correct?
Correct. And it's there's also that, but there's also the aspect of get to know your employees, and they,
Mm.
even in the 80s, like they strive that a lot, like getting to know your employees by communicating with them. And it's just a good leadership style, just a good management style. So in another word, like in other words, I guess, is that for me, communicating with them was to get to know them, what makes them tick. I use that in hockey as well. What motivates this specific player?
Mhm.
Because what a motive, like I can tell a pre-game speech, for example, and it can motivate 12 players out of 18, but for the other six, it's like, yeah, whatever. Nothing, like my pre-game speech didn't motivate them at all. So I needed to find out what every player, what makes them tick, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. Do I need to be really hard on this player, or just say it's just a mistake, don't worry about it, it'll work out. It all depends on the type of player that you want, right? How they function. And the same thing applies for when I was a police officer on the street, is that I got to know some of these people. It helped also. It was kind of, it's kind of damn if you do, damn if you don't, I guess. But I spent way too long in Rishabakto, which was the main cause of my PTSD. Uh, but on the other hand, is that I got to know a lot of the players that we dealt with a lot. So the more that I got, I guess the more experience that I got, the less that I had to use physical violence to arrest these violent offenders.
Okay. Yeah, it's really a great illustration of human resource leadership from what I'm hearing from you. Did you ever consider pursuing anything further in that area where you had that interest doing a business degree?
I actually, I had applied for the RCMP. I had gotten accepted a year before I was scheduled to graduate. I decided to graduate with a bachelor's degree anyways, because the recruiting office in Fredericton here in New Brunswick had told me that they would just put my file aside, and when I graduated, just to call them and they would reactivate it, and it would go. And so yeah, so I had applied actually to do my master's degree in in HR
Okay.
at the University of Sherbrooke.
Hmm.
But when push came to shove, I decided no, that's my heart is to go at the RCMP Academy in Regina, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a police officer, and I wanted to be a police officer at the time with the best police force in the world.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's how it turned out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've
Yeah.
always enjoyed managing. I've always enjoyed leadership books, even psychological books in the sense of I'm trying to remember the name, but it was a sports psychology book written by a sports psychologist. But how it was written, you could use that in everyday life. So I just love the way the mind works. It's something that intrigues me, and I know it's a very complex organ. I
Mm.
found that out. And yeah, so I always try to keep myself, not keep myself, but keep myself busy, I guess, yeah, to keep educating myself and keep informing myself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the other things we talked about in our last connection was about camaraderie. And the reason we started talking about that is because I had an interest, of course, as you recall, about the chapter titles, and one was titled Camaraderie. And when we talked about camaraderie, you made several references in our last connection to Black humor, using Black humor, dark humor to deal with, I don't know if these were your words, but and I hope I'm not misquoting you, but to deal with trauma, to deal with some of the things that you faced on a regular basis. What did that mean to you? Like what was the benefit? Why did you use the Black humor, dry humor, dark humor? What was that a tool that was useful with people that you worked with? Tell us more about that.
Uh, for the Black humor, dark humor, however you want to call it, it's not only it's a to me, and it's been actually confirmed with psychologists that I've seen, is that the Black humor is actually a mechanism that the mind uses to detach itself from reality, what
Oh,
you're
okay.
actually seeing. It's because actually it kind of made me think about I think it's W5, that's a Canadian
Hmm.
news show,
Yes.
because I keep mistaking them between W5 and 60 Minutes. So
Mm.
W5, and they had actually a documentary a while back, and I remember this particular retired Ontario provincial police officer had retired in the late 70s. I think it was 78, 79. And even he was talking about how he suffered from mental trauma and all that. And even back then in the 70s, I mean, I didn't even hear about that in 87 when I went through my training. So let
Hmm.
alone, 8 years before when he retired, or even before that, he was working. And one question I remember that stuck in my mind is that what kept you in the job? What kept you sane in the job? And he said, sense of humor, just like that, as dry as that. He said,
Okay.
without my sense of humor, he said, if you're going to be in a police business without a sense of humor, you're going to go crazy. You're going to
Mhm.
lose your mind.
Yeah.
So I think the mind kind of recognizes that we see a lot, and it's protecting us from going crazy, I guess, or from losing our mind, or just for us to just break down by having Black humor come in. For
Yeah.
example, and I think that's what I was trying to explain yesterday with the camaraderie, is that it's a huge peer support group, because only within ourselves it seems that we can understand ourselves, and we feel free of using that Black humor to detach ourselves from what we're really feeling. But
Mm.
on the other side, the person listening, the receiver of that message, understands. He understands, or she understands, that I'm using this Black humor not because I'm trying to belittle that person that committed suicide or trying to mock the person that committed suicide or to mock the family. It's a defense mechanism that I use because I've gone through at least a dozen of these calls. And to process that every time without seeing a mental health counselor, which I don't recommend anymore if I had to redo my career, is that's the type of humor we use. And for example, I'll use an example, and hopefully this won't insult anybody, but I can use an example. And I worked with an auxiliary at one point, and we had a call of of a person that had committed suicide, had been there for about 3 days that they figured. And so we got a call finally. Nobody was seeing this guy for 3 days. They called us, do a welfare check. We go in there, find him lying on the bed, and he shot himself with a 410 right in the forehead.
Wow.
So without going into the gruesome details and all that, and so the auxiliary who at the time worked at about $5 for a shift because they were doing this on a voluntary basis. He asked me like, how's the scene? Like he wanted to know basically, is this like a really gruesome scene? He didn't want to go inside the room, and I don't blame him. If you don't need to go, don't go.
Sure. And
I basically looked at him and I said, well, and at the time, it was at the time where that movie Dick Tracy came out with Warren Beatty. And I said, well, you saw that movie, Dick Tracy. He says, yeah. I said, well, he looks like Flat Top because basically his head had shrunk because everything had, without going into details. And that's how I protected myself from that. But whenever I tell that story to a psychologist, not this part, but after, I can never, ever say it without breaking down, because his son had actually called, left a message on the old voice recording machines. And I saw there was 3 messages because I wanted to know like why this person committed suicide. Maybe he received a threatening message or whatever.
Yeah.
So I listened to and one of them was his 8-year-old son that actually had called. I think it was 8 years old, 7 or 8 year old, that had called to wish him a happy Father's Day. He was in Ontario with the mom. He was there, small community near Miramichi, New Brunswick. Had, I don't know if that was a trigger, but the Father's Day was on Sunday, and we discovered the body on Wednesday, and the coroner had said he had died probably on Sunday.
Wow.
We put 1 and 1 together, and I actually was able. I tried today, and today went pretty well, but without going into details, what was said on the machine, I know that one I could not. There's no way I could repeat what was said, and I still remember those words for word.
It's interesting. It's interesting you use the word defense mechanism. It's like a coping mechanism, I guess, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. On the related topic of still staying with the camaraderie, because I think it's a really interesting chapter in your book, as well as a number of different references through the book. You talk about something. Excuse me, after shifts. I think that's the word you use, the term you use, and correct me if I'm wrong. And the after shifts, I guess, were an opportunity to let loose, to talk, and perhaps some of this dark humor. Is that the case? Like, I'm assuming that was the case. Were after shifts important for you, for other police officers?
Without realizing it, it was. And the first psychologist I saw when I was stationed in the Yukon, when I was posted in the Yukon, actually pinpointed that specific, like pretty specific, that's when, by digging into my mind and all that, we came out with this, not a solution, but I guess a result that my mind started to unravel, like mental health started to unravel in a negative way when those after shifts stopped. I didn't have anybody else. And for me, I think, for me specifically, yes, personally, I guess it was very important because it was a means for me to let the steam out after a 7-day stretch of shifts of working on the streets.
Sure.
So yeah, I think they were pretty important. I think they are important. It's just maybe some of them that shouldn't drink alcohol during those after shifts, because that's what really triggered the whole mess.
Of course. Yeah, that makes sense. Just, I'm going to shift gears, as I tend to do a little bit, I guess, with our discussions, and I hope you don't mind.
No, not at all.
The chapter titles, that was great that we talked about camaraderie. Chapter 8 was called Toughening Up. And toughening up is an interesting one, and it really sort of falls right in line with our current discussion. What is toughening up? What did that mean for you as a police officer?
You kind of caught me off guard, and I kind of like that actually. But I'm trying to think, did I try to say toughening up by mentally toughening up, or toughening up by just being tough, or even if you have a little bit of pain, physical pain, you keep going. I think I meant the mental toughness of it. It I'm gonna try and answer this way. When I
Mhm.
first started, especially in Rishabakto, where after my first posting in Joliet, after Akwesasne, after the Oka crisis,
Mhm.
is that here we're not like the backup for a provincial police in Brunswick. We're it. We're like the municipal or the county sheriff or however you want to call it.
Yeah.
We're the police. So for me, when I came from Quebec Division to New Brunswick in Rishabakto, I I will say that was scared. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what was going to happen. And I remember the first physical arrest I had to make, I almost lost control of the guy's arm, which would have been probably really dangerous because he just wanted to fight. And that scared me. Just that little thing of almost losing control scared me. And then I try to hide it or stuff it down, and it's okay, it'll go away, you'll learn how to deal with these issues. So that was a way of me talking to try to my mental health, I guess, or my toughness inside my mind. And I guess it was maybe the drive inside of me that really wanted to make this work, really wanted to be a police officer. And that's why it's very important for me. Not important, I shouldn't say that, but it was important for me to toughen up because I really wanted to have a career in policing, and I had no choice. It was either that I toughened up mentally, or I found something else to do in life as a career.
Sure.
That was one aspect of it. The other aspect is that to stuff everything down and to, like, people saying you got to toughen up, you got to move on past that, you got to you have to there's nothing there. Other officers have seen that type of scenes before you. Other officers after you will see scenes after from you like these. So there's also that aspect of toughening up mentally, which is, of course, we know today, which is the worst thing you can do. You need to process all these things down. But at the time, I think that's what I wanted to explain. I don't know if that's what
Mhm.
if that answers the question you were looking for. If not, like,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah, it
can
certainly
definitely
does.
clarify.
And I would suggest from what I just heard you say that it might be perceived as another one of those defense or coping mechanisms, but if I'm hearing you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, probably not the best defense or coping mechanism.
It's a defense. I can say, and maybe a psychologist or psychiatrist might say that I'm wrong, but I think it's a short term. I think it's necessary for short term to
Okay.
protect your mind short term. Just because when I'm done, like, for example, it could be like a busy Friday night. I could go from a fatal accident, take 2, 3, 4 hours out of the shift and doing the investigation there. And then once I'm done, going from there to a bar fight, and then from there to a violent domestic dispute, and then to a fight in the middle of of a ball field or something like that where youths are hanging around. So you don't have time to process. So you have to file it away, file it away, file it away. The danger is that when you've gone 1, 2, or 3 months like that without ever processing any of that, that's where the issues start, like the real negative issues start. That's my opinion. Again, of course, I'm not a medical professional by any means, but that's my belief. I truly believe. And then imagine now you have officers with, never mind 1, 2, or 3 months, it's 2, 3, 4, 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years without having any of that trauma, any of those interaction or violent confrontations processed ever by a medical professional.
So it's a cumulative
That's,
process that builds up.
it does. And there's never anything good that comes out of that. And I truly believe that that's where you see a lot of police brutality, if you want to call it. It's to me, I mean, there might be some that are really bad police officers. I'm not denying that, but I believe that the majority of the police brutality, when you look at police officers, without naming anything, I look specifically for how many years of service they had, because they say that in the news. You know, police officer so and so, 12 years service, 12-year veteran of the police force. 12
Mhm.
years. Now, my next question would be to that reporter: ask them how many times he went and saw a medical professional in those 12 years. And I
Interesting.
can almost bet you that they would say maybe once because they were forced to go, or
Yeah.
twice, whatever.
Yeah.
But how many times did they go voluntarily and they admitted that they had an issue? I would bet you probably zero,
Wow.
because that happened to me. I'm not saying it went as far as certain, but it came close without realizing. I just realized that today, or when I started to go see psychologists.
Mhm.
That's when I started reflecting back, going like, "Holy crap! I'm lucky I didn't get into more trouble than that."
Mhm.
But it
Mm.
was all unprocessed trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't. It's like one officer that actually, and that was a while back. I'm kind of surprised actually. It's just dawned on me, but he had told me he had gone seen a psychologist because he had gotten in trouble with police abuse. He had actually gotten formally charged for assault, went to criminal court and everything. Still kept his job because it was a minor assault, but still, like, he went to court and he said, he told me, he said, Norm, you can't put a kettle full of water on a stove, turn the stove sky high, and put a lid there and keep it sealed and hoping that it'll stay intact. It's never going. At one point, it's going to blow because the steam inside there is going to get. There's going to be so much volume. I guess I'm not a physician, but that it'll actually. It might not blow, but it's going to crack. It's not going to be well at one
Yeah.
point. The same thing applies to the mind.
Mhm.
At one point, you can stuff it down. It's going to work. But at one point it's going to blow, and that's what you have. You don't have a blow up that's controlled. It's uncontrolled, and that's where I think that's where the police violence comes in, where it's unwarranted.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. It's yeah. Wow. That's amazing. Switching gears again a little bit. I want to talk about something that you talk about quite a bit in your book, and all this is of course related. Adrenaline rush. For me, adrenaline rush might be when I come really close to bumping into a car in traffic. And of course, different things kick in. Adrenaline kicks in, and you respond. What's it mean for a police officer? What's adrenaline rush, and what does it result in? And how do you recognize it?
I think adrenaline rush for police officers is the same as any other human being. It's just we get to go on that high more often than, let's say, somebody from
Mm,
the general public. So for us, adrenaline rush, especially when you first start in policing, could be 2, 3 times on a shift.
wow.
Well, for somebody from the general public, it might be 2, 3 times in a year, or 2, 3 times in their lifetime.
Sure.
So it all depends on the type of area they live in, and how and how they live their lives. I mean, some people are just adrenaline junkies and they go climb mountains without ropes or anything like that. I mean, some
Yeah.
people climb the Eiffel Tower just for that rush. Um, but for people, like, generally speaking, I don't think police officers are any different than the general population. It's just we see that adrenaline more often. We feel it more often, I should say. And at one point, it's like anything else, is that at one point you become, I shouldn't say immune, but it's like when you start taking drugs, of course, or if you drink alcohol, it's going to take more alcohol or more drugs to get that same high that you had that first time. The same thing applies for adrenaline, in my opinion, is that after a while, getting close to being hit, like assaulted, adrenaline goes way up. Then after that happens 12, 20, 15, 20, 50, 20, 25 times, well, is that, do you still have that same rush for that same similar or close type of incident? My guess it would be no. And that's where that adrenaline rush or adrenaline junkie, that's where I feel, and I think I'm not the only one that feels this way or felt that way when they were a police officer, is that when it gets really slow, is that it's almost like your mind is craving that drug, that adrenaline. I need
Ah,
something to, and that's where you start. I kind of laugh about it because I laugh at myself, not at the situation, because I was pretty. I should have gone seen help at the time, but that's when I would stop, vehicles. If I would spot a vehicle, let's say of a person that I knew was a break and enter guy that had an extensive record in breaking and entering in houses or camps or cottages,
Mhm.
and I would stop that vehicle and just push that person to react towards me in a negative way, so I could arrest that person for, let's say, assault a police officer or obstructing a police officer. And then that would give me that excuse to take this person down hard. And again, that would be like a really overreaction. I'm not saying that to brag and, hey, look how tough I was. This is saying how stupid it was,
Mhm.
how I could have gotten in so much trouble if there would have been some iPhones or smartphones back then that could record.
Mhm.
And I guess my message here is that this is why it's very important for police officers or paramedics or firefighters, military, correctional officers to go seek psychological help, professional help, because to not go to this point where it now is like me, it's almost a point of no return, to the point that I need to manage my triggers now, and it's an everyday battle. But I'm okay with it now. I've settled. I made peace with myself, and that's just my new reality. But that's fine. I get better at it every day. And that's why I think my message for that part is for first responders. My God, don't wait. Don't wait.
Yeah, and your messages, your experience, and what you share in your book is so beneficial for police officers, for first responders, for the general public, really. And it's interesting when you talk about the possibly having a let's say it was a challenging shift where you had 20 to 25 adrenaline rushes. That must have a cumulative effect on you. That must be like you must look at the end of one of those shifts, and I hope there weren't that many of them, but maybe there were. I would like to think that at the end of that, you would be okay. But it must have been very challenging. Like that, I know like you almost suggested that it was a point sometimes if there weren't a lot of adrenaline rushes, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think it was almost like there was a craving for it. Is the way you sort of, that's how I interpreted it, at least. And correct me
Yeah.
again if I'm wrong.
No,
But
that's pretty much what it is. Yes.
yeah, okay. And the ones where you have so many adrenaline rushes, I can't imagine. It must be very challenging to your mental health at the end of them. It must be very challenging to unwind.
The well, for one thing, yeah, it's almost impossible to unwind. Actually, there's one, but before I go there, there's one example I wanted to give. But
Okay.
the it is very, very taxing physically on the body. That's
Mhm.
like going through. I mean, I'm not going to say, because I want this podcast and my book also is to stay as real as possible. I don't think I've ever, well, not, I've never experienced a shift where I had 20, 25 like adrenaline rush. Uh, and maybe I did, but I don't think it was as bad as that. But definitely 2 or 3 would definitely be the norm
Okay.
per shift.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, one time, remember, it was like chaotic. I mean, you got in the car as soon as you finished a call, and it was like 2, 3 calls waiting for you, and just pick one up and off you went. And I remember after we were the last one to finish the shift, just me and my partner. And when I say my partner, it's not like my vehicle partner, it's just my partner for responding to calls. We each had
Okay.
a vehicle. But
Okay.
we decided just to go where the Rishabakto Marina was. There was a nice park bench. It was summer, nice summer night. I think it was like 4 o'clock in the morning. We just went there. We just sat down. We looked at each other and we just let a huge sigh out, both of us. It was like, what a friggin' night. I couldn't believe what we went through. I couldn't believe the amount of calls we had to handle. And just staring, and I'm saying this story because I've got a reason for it. Just staring at the ocean there with the moon, shining on it, and the tranquility of it. And now one of the tools I use, and it's kind of funny because I felt good. I remember that because it felt good just to unwind, just look at that. You know what? Now that I look back at it, that's a type of meditation.
Mhm.
And I use that today. And meditation is not like what I thought. It was kind of a stereotyping of, the Buddhists. They're sitting in with the hands closed like this. And meditation can be as simple as just that. It's just enjoying the scenery and just being there in the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
And by using that today, it's like it to me, it feels so good when I come out of that. And it's like anything else, you have to practice. You can't get discouraged because it's not working that well the first time or the first 6 times. You got to keep at it. And now I'm so happy that I kept with it. And I wanted to tell that story because by doing the meditation, it reminded me of that time, how it felt so good from after that chaotic shift, just to sit down and having that tranquility at 4 o'clock in the morning. There's no traffic. There's nothing. There's just me and my partner just staying quiet.
Yeah, that's interesting. You brought up a couple things, and we're at the end of our time, so we're going to wrap up with this. But I'd love to follow up with a couple of things that you just talked about. It's the first time that you've made reference to the physical impact, to what it can do, and also a little bit about another, obviously, an effective coping mechanism around meditation and what that means to you. So thank you again for this. It's been very informative, very interesting, and some great responses and learning more about your book. So until next time, again, thanks very much.
Thank you, Rick, for having me.
Okay, so long.